Hello, students. Today we get into some actual development over time. We've talked about some basics in psychology and lifespan development research. Now we'll see some change over time in specifically physical development. The first topic, though, is your nervous system. So there's a couple specific things to get into with the nervous system. One of the key takeaways is that the brain is plastic. Plasticity is not about it being actually like physically plastic, but when I say plasticity, think about like moldable, movable, something like rubber, bendable, changeable. The brain can change and modify. You can teach an old dog or an old human new tricks. So basically what's happening here is the physical connections between neurons are changing. They are making new branches, new connections, new networks to get stronger and stronger and stronger. And the reason I have a picture of a taxi here is because it's a really good example of this plasticity. The study that this study looked at taxi drivers in London and compared them to just normal Londoners, other people who live there. And they looked at the specific area where most people store kind of our mental maps. So there's a specific area of your brain where there's a density of and connections between neurons to help you remember and networks to help you remember how to get to your house from school, where things are in your house. So your own mental maps of areas. And they looked at these areas in the brains of taxi drivers in London, and they were incredibly, incredibly dense. So a lot of mass in those areas versus the Londoners, the people who lived in the same place, had much less density in those areas of their brain. And so one of the possibilities is that maybe people who have more density in the map area of their brain tend to become taxi drivers. No, but really, the more likely case is that people who are taxi drivers are using that area of their brain more. And that's what it actually ended up being, is that because these taxi drivers had to practice driving all around all the time, have to have a really good mental map of London. They have to know the ins and outs, the side streets, the back roads, the places that aren't really roads, but they can get through to save a couple of minutes, to get more money, that kind of thing. They have a lot more axon branches and dendrites in their neural network and in their brain for those areas. So with that being said, we'll explain the axon branches, the dendrites, but also hopefully you've also read the chapter so you recognize those terms. They have so many more dendrites, so many more axon branches that they could actually measure more density in the brain in those areas. So that's plasticity. It can change over time based on habits, based on things you do, based on your own learning over time. So with that, also another piece of this is integration. The brain does integrate a lot of information. Right now, it's integrating the visuals, so the sight, the light, the sound, maybe the temperature of the room that you're in. Are you getting messages from your organs? Are you hungry? Are you needing to use the bathroom? All of this, the brain is integrating and giving you what is the most important to you right now. So if you're driving down the street, a dog jumps out, hopefully your brain tells you pay attention to the dog, don't hit the dog kind of thing. Versus right now, hopefully you're paying attention to the lecture and the examples and think of your own examples. Right? So the brain does all that. It integrates. So plasticity and integration are some of the big key features and functions of the brain. Integration is also how we make memories, make meaningful connections to things, and a lot of those processes biologically at the cellular level are really the same. So we'll talk about that in this chapter and as we go throughout the textbook. There are other cells other than just neurons in the brain and in the nervous system in general. So let's talk about a couple of those types of cells. Glial cells are kind of a category of a bunch of different kinds of cells that give support to neurons. So one of the things that they do is insulating neuron. The myelin sheath actually comes from a specific type of glial cell. They are involved in communication. We are learning more and more that glial cells do more than we used to think that they did in regards to the communication in the brain. For example, some of these glial cells, they make more neurotransmitters to be used by neurons. And they can also, it seems like some of them are also sending some messages or part of the message pathway, as well as neurons. And then they do nutrients, like bringing nutrients to neurons, taking waste away from neurons. So there's a whole system of cells in the nervous system, not only neurons, even though that's what we often focus on. And really, research has focused on them for decades and only really started looking at glial cells more recently. So the neurons are the green part here that interconnected to other neurons, and the glial cells are these red ones. Another thing that the glial cells do is they can literally be a scaffolding that neurons kind of hang on to as well in the brain. So glial cells are another part of this process. But here is a neuron, and my face might be in front of some of the words here, but here we've got dendrites. Those are essentially the antennas. Well, I guess I've got some slides to go over these. So let's go one at a time from the slides. We've got the cell body. And this is an important thing to remember. A neuron is a cell. Just like other cells in your body, it has a nucleus, which directs the growth and maintenance of the cell. So it is a living cell. With that, it needs energy, it has waste, and these neurons, they want to be efficient. They have a very particular job, but they also want to be efficient. And that's why some of the things that we have in our brain affect a lot of our behavior. So we will see how that happens over time. But remember, it is a cell. It wants to be efficient. It wants to use basically as little energy as it possibly can. And that's some of the reason that we see some of the things coming out of the brain or that we do with our brain. Habits. Habits are really easy to do because the brain has learned run this pathway really easily and it's very efficient at doing that. But if we try to break that habit, that makes the neurons use a lot more energy and they don't like to do that, so it's harder to do it. So, as one example. All right, so that's the cell body, does cell things. There's mitochondria in there, that kind of thing. Axons are this long. You could think of it as a highway, communication line, pathway, telephone wire, something like that. It carries information away from the cell. And then it's got axon branches, and you can grow extra axon branches to connect to lots of different neurons. But as the main axon here, there's only one per neuron. In humans, that can be up to 3 feet long. Basically, it goes from the base of your or the top of your spine to the bottom of your spine is your longest axons. So in a giraffe, they can be like 3 meters. I think a blue whale, I looked it up, and they can be ridiculously long. I forget, like 20 something. Forget if it was feet or meters. As big as a blue whale, or about the equivalent length of how far their spine goes. Really, really long axons. But the message doesn't slow down, doesn't degrade throughout the process of going down the axon. And we'll talk about how that happens, the actual physical chemical process that leads to that message coming from up here all the way down to the end to the synapses. All right, so that's the axon, takes the message out. Dendrites are these ones up here, and they bring a message in. You could think of them as antennas, receivers. They are getting a message from other neurons nearby, and then they are, if the message is strong enough, they will send the message on to other neurons in the network. So most cells have a lot of dendrites. You can make more dendrites and more axon branches. That's basically what's happening with plasticity, as well as the connections that exist getting stronger or weaker. That's how our brain is able to modify and change over time. And then last, this myelin sheath. This is basically an insulation layer. The glial cells actually produce this and insulate the axons. And essentially what it does is it speeds the transmission. So with that, the signal doesn't get weaker as we go down, but with a myelin sheath, it can be faster. So that is a really nice thing. If there's no myelin sheath, it is a standard speed. And then with the myelin sheath, it is faster. And with that, it's a really good example of diseases affecting specific parts of the brain. Multiple sclerosis, or MS, actually affects the myelin sheath. It damages it and hardens it, which leads to the neurons being slower, making it more difficult to make consistent networks. It can also lead to damage where this axon's message gets sent to another dendrite it's not supposed to be getting sent to. So it can lead to a lot of neurological problems with that from MS. And that's really just attacking the myelin sheath. So with this, let's take a look at a quick video about a human stem cell specializing into a neuron. It's a pretty neat process. It really only takes about 14 hours, and this is how we get new neurons. So neurons themselves, they don't go through division. They don't do mitosis. They do not split into new neurons. Some cells in our body do this. A lot of cells in our body do mitosis, so we can kind of replenish and renew cells, but neurons do not. So the only way we get them is from stem cells becoming neurons. And most of that process, as we'll see, happens before we're about age 2. So a lot of it happens in prenatal, and then we get a lot happening into most of it happens prenatally, but it continues till about age 2. And then there's only a few places in the brain where we still have neurogenesis happening, where stem cells become new neurons, but it doesn't seem to really have an impact in humans. But we might see later on that maybe it can, or maybe we can make it happen more. But let's watch a couple quick videos about this. Oh, opened in the wrong tab, but that's okay. I'll find the correct video and then pull it over to the correct screen. All right, this is it. It's just a song during it. There's not any words or anything for this video. So keep a watch at the time as these processes are happening. So these are human stem cells, and the stem cells dividing here in mitosis. So the neurogenic cell medium is basically a chemical that is in the brain. Naturally, it happens as we're developing, that tells the stem cell, one, that it needs to stop dividing, it needs to start becoming a stem cell. It gives its I'm trying to say myelination, the methylation. It tells the cell it's supposed to be a stem cell. So you can see some of these becoming more neuron-like, sending out axons and dendrites, mostly dendrites probably, because remember, again, there's one long axon with lots of branches. So there'll be, I think, one more clip in here that makes it really clear what's happening. I think it zooms in like right over here in a moment. But pay attention for this with the time on this last one. All right, here we go. So the process of that close to neuron becoming an actual neuron, we'll watch this happen. So that stem cell is now a neuron. This over here, let's see if I can pause it. It's trying to make me annotate the video. That's not what I want to do. But this is probably its axon. It's got a bunch of dendrites here, the cell body, some extra stuff left over from it kind of reabsorbing other components that are part of the stem cell. But you can see others of these in the background are in different stages of that formation. So overall, this process of neurons becoming, or stem cells becoming neurons, is quite a quick process. That being said, it also leads us to understand how quickly we can develop new dendrites and axon branches. It seems like that can happen in as little as like 4 hours to 8 hours, and a lot of that happens while you're asleep. So let's see we'll next watch a video about how the neuron actually sends messages and how it receives messages within the axon, how it sends that signal all the way down. That'll be the next thing that we watch. Now, this video goes into a lot more detail than you need to know for the class, but I think having a little bit of extra information is helpful, especially if you're going into biology classes as well. You'll hear some of these same terms and some of these same things. So getting a little bit more knowledge is helpful. But with that being said, you don't have to have everything in this video memorized. There's a couple key components that I'll come back to make sure are clear.
How does the pain you experience when you burn your hand result so quickly in an action by your muscles? Many animals respond to environmental stimuli using specialized cells called neurons. A stimulus is detected by sensory receptors, and the body responds through motor effectors. These cells working together allow you to respond very quickly to threats. When you touch something hot, heat receptors of a sensory neuron detect the stimuli and send the information of heat to an interneuron in your central nervous system. From there, a motor neuron sends a response from your central nervous system to the skeletal muscles in your arm.
All right, so there we see a couple different types of neurons. We see this is called an efferent and afferent neuron, or the neuron giving the sense in and the neuron giving the message out. And here's the interneuron, just like the ones in your brain. So you can see there's a bunch of dendrites hanging off it. There's the axon. It's connected over here. Here you see the different components, but you still see the cell body. Sensory neuron is basically specialized. So the receiving end you could think of as a specialized type of dendrite. So there's sensory neurons for taste, for light, for hearing. And then the motor neuron ends in a synapse like all neurons do, but this synapse sends basically specific chemicals that activate the muscle. So that's why things like salt can activate a fish's muscle. If you're, say, cutting up and filleting a fish and you put salt on it, it might actually contract the muscle because the muscle cells are getting the message from that chemical. And that's essentially what's at the end of these synapses. But here, the interneuron is usually what we focus on in this class, even though it is not the only one in this process. Again, in your nervous system, all the sensory neurons, all the motor neurons, they're all part of your nervous system, and so are your endocrine system, all the hormone producing organs that also talk to the brain as well. But yeah, so that message comes in here, goes into your spinal cord and back to your muscles. With that being said, for this kind of process, something really dangerous for your limbs, this is a really interesting adaptation humans have. We send that message just to our spinal cord, and then the spinal cord sends a message back to the motor neuron to pull back quickly. That is helpful so that we don't get really damaged or burned as easily. So a nice little adaptation. So that jerking away motion, that is all your body doing it by itself. And then you realize it about the same time because neurons are really fast. So, but you're not actually making the decision to pull it back. Your spinal cord just did it for you.
Causing them to contract and pull your hand away. The fundamental process of neural transmission that underlies this action occurs in all neurons of the body. Neurons transmit.
All right, so to be clear, because that kind of zoomed in really, really quickly, this is the inside of a neuron, or the axon right here. This is basically the membrane of the axon wall. This is the inside of the axon. This is the outside of the axon. You can see some other neurons back there within this soup. So there's a negative charge inside, a slightly positive charge outside because of ions. So we've got sodium, and then we've got potassium is the K plus over here. So the sodium and potassium ions. And this really basic cellular process of ions moving back and forth is in a chain reaction is the whole process by which neurons work and send a message. So that's a little basics about it. Then we'll watch this video and talk about some examples of that. But hopefully this is pretty clear.
This information through changes in the electrical potential of the membrane by the movement of ions across the membrane. An electrochemical gradient governs the movement of these ions, resulting in an electrical impulse. The resting membrane potential in a neuron, when the cell is not firing an impulse, is established by the unequal distribution of sodium ions outside of the cell and potassium ions inside the cell, making the outside of the cell more positively charged compared to the inside. The electrochemical gradient is
So here we have these potassium, they're usually inside, the sodium is usually outside, and the difference is that we change this positive. Well, this one's a little more negative than this side, and that's a very basic, important piece of this puzzle.
Established and maintained by an enzyme called sodium potassium ATPase. When a neuron is stimulated, sodium ion channels open and sodium ions flow into the cell. This leads to a change in the electrical potential across the membrane called depolarization. The depolarizing electrical potential travels down.
So these dendrites are having this same process happen on them. And so visually, this is this little glow, but you wouldn't actually necessarily see like a glow. It's just ions moving in and out of the cell. But just to visualize, that's why there's a little glow on top.
On the dendrites and over the cell body. Multiple electrical potentials will combine at the axon hillock in a process called summation. If the depolarization is large enough, an action potential is triggered. Action potentials are all or none electrical impulses that maintain their amplitude and strength down the length of the axon.
Basically, what that means is that message does not get weaker. It doesn't matter if you have that 3-foot axon. It doesn't matter if it's a 3 mm axon. It does not get weaker down that whole axon. And this is why.
The action potential travels down the axon when the depolarization of an area of membrane causes adjacent voltage-gated sodium ion channels to open. The influx of sodium ions results in membrane depolarization along the membrane.
All right, so to be clear again, let's go back to the beginning as it starts traveling. It's basically a chain reaction of gates along the axon that let more sodium ions in at a time.
Their amplitude and strength down the length of the axon. The action potential travels down the axon when the depolarization of an area of membrane causes adjacent voltage-gated sodium ion channels to open. The influx of sodium ions results in membrane depolarization along the membrane. After a short delay, potassium ion channels open and potassium ions flow out, repolarizing the membrane. For the neuron to fire again, the resting membrane potential needs to be reestablished. Sodium-potassium ATPase is used to move sodium and potassium ions against their concentration gradients, reestablishing the resting membrane potential.
All right, so here we get a better view of the whole cross section. Before we were looking at basically this area and we saw the inside of the cell. Now we're getting both sides to get a better sense of this is the inside of the axon. So there's not something like shooting down the axon. It's not a sending an ion down. It's not sending an electron down. It is not anything moving all the way down this. These ions are moving a very, very small distance, like very microscopic distance across this chasm, across this channel, into the axon, outside the axon, into the axon, outside the axon. That's all they're moving. That's why these can be such a fast process. It said like after a short delay, it will go back to the normal resting potential. What that short delay means is for humans, about 200 times a second is about what most of our neurons are firing at. It seems like they are physically capable of firing faster than that, but you could say that human neurons have about a standard or an average of a 200 times a second refresh rate. So if you can think of like a monitor or a TV, the hertz or the refresh rate of how quickly it will redo the picture on the whole screen. Um, our neurons do that about 200 times a second. They can go faster in some places in your body. They do go faster, but that's like on average what most are processing things at is 200 times a second, which is pretty neat. But again, that 200 times is not because it's shooting something down this axon that's 3 feet long. It's moving something a very, very minuscule difference, an ion, a single molecule or a couple molecules back and forth.
As the action potential moves down the axon, ions are diffusing only a short distance, allowing the signal to move quickly. At the axon terminal, the electrical impulse passes to another cell at a cellular connection called a synapse. The space between the presynaptic neuron.
So as a reminder, there's a lot of things in this video that you don't necessarily have to have memorized. If you don't remember sodium ion or ATPase or whatever it is, that is okay for the purpose of this class. Knowing that those ions go back and forth just across the axon, and that is what makes the charge change. The charge is changing in a chain reaction. The charge is changing in a wave. It's a very fast wave, but it's like if you were to do the wave in a sports stadium, That's basically the process here. And then when it gets to the end, it sends out some specific types of neurotransmitters across, and then that starts the process on the next cell.
And a postsynaptic cell is called the synaptic cleft. The presynaptic neuron contains signal molecules called neurotransmitters that are packaged inside vesicles. When an action potential reaches the end of a neuron, neurotransmitters are released by exocytosis from the neuron into the synaptic cleft. Neurotransmitters bind to the adjacent cell at receptor sites attached to ion channels. The channels open, allowing the movement of ions into or out of the effector cell, which alters its membrane potential, thereby transmitting the signal from the neuron to the effector cell.
So again, that neurotransmitter activates the gates on the next neuron, which can start the pattern there to send a message. So that is the basic process of neurons sending messages. Let's close out of that and go back to here. There's another video here linked that if you still want more information, it goes into the chemistry a lot more detailed. So if that would be helpful for you, feel free to watch that video. Otherwise, we're not going to watch it. So here the action potential is just what we describe, the electrical chemical activity reaching a peak to send the message. So during that, the electrical charge across the membrane changes dramatically, and so that usually positive outside and negative inside swap at that place, and that opens the next gate in line, which opens the next gate in line, and so that charge, that positive inside charge moves as a wave or a chain reaction down the axon. So, and at the synaptic cleft, after those neurotransmitters get pushed out into it, they also get reuptaked. They get vacuumed up, essentially, back into the original cell so that it can use them again. So if you think of someone who's taking a medicine to boost their serotonin, that can do that in a lot of ways. It can lead to more serotonin in the cell. It can lead to more inside the synaptic cleft. It can lead to better reuptaking or slower reuptaking, depending on what you're wanting to do. And so that's why different medicines work slightly different for different people. My keyboard is not clicking well for going between these slides. So the importance of this is that this axon and this neuron and these dendrites, this is involved in all the processes that we're doing in life. When we're thinking, when we're remembering, our feelings of love, our perceptions, our experience, when we create something, just our life and experiencing and living life, this is all happening in large part because of these neurons and how they're connecting with each other, how they're communicating with each other, and a lot of the things that we see in humans, whether it's abnormal psychology related things or building habits or breaking habits or learning new things or studying, a lot of it comes down to how can we leverage how our neurons work to how we have to learn. And so that is one of the things that we'll learn both in this class as well as through other psych classes that you take. But hopefully you'll learn a few of those things that change over the lifespan as well. Because this myelination, for example, it's one of the biggest things that changes over a longer period of the lifespan. So let's talk about that and those basics. And we'll start off with infancy. So infancy is one other time where we're really looking at some dramatic changes in the brain. So prenatally, we have a lot of stem cells becoming neurons, moving to where they're going to live, and that's happening still up until all through infancy, up until age 2, where basically all of the rest of your brain is not making new neurons. There's a couple specific areas, but it doesn't look right now like those new stem cells becoming neurons, like those new neurons are having much of an impact. So in infancy, some of the other changes that are happening is myelination. So you do have some new stem cells becoming neurons, migrating to where they're going to live in your brain, and then you've got a lot of myelination happening. Essentially, myelination happens from about your brain stem, kind of forward through your brain to the prefrontal cortex in the end, and that finishes up around 23. And so with this, you're also making tons of new connections. In infants, you're making so many more connections, or spreading out at least, the dendrites and axon branches more than you necessarily need at that time. So you're making 2 times as many connections as you might need. Basically, the brain's saying, hey, I'm going to try and make connections, and then whatever it doesn't use, it will reabsorb those dendrites and axon branches to be more efficient. But at this time, up through age 2, it is doing a lot of sending out those axon branches and dendrites. So any given neuron can be connected to as many as 1,000 other neurons. So it may be getting messages from 500 neurons. And so part of many series of connections and pathways for specific things that your brain does. And it might be connected on the axon end to another 500 neurons. There are so many networks in our brain, and we can make them fairly quickly. We can make new dendrites and axon branches within a like 8 hours time period, and then strengthen those, make it more efficient, make it easier for the neuron to fire those things as we learn things. So the process of reabsorbing those axon branches and dendrites, that is called pruning. So it's not actually like clipped off. Basically, the cell just like reabsorbs and recycles that material. But that is what's happening in infancy. So we've got an example here at birth. Oh, where's my mouse? There you are. So here is at birth. Then we've got at 1 month, 3 months, 15 months, and 24 months, how dense the brain is. If you think back to our examples from the taxi drivers, their brains in those specific areas for mental maps are very, very dense with axon branches and dendrites. So we make that many, and then we can cut back on the ones that we are not actually using. So if you need a little more information on plasticity, this is another great video. It does go over some of the same things we've just covered, so we're not going to watch it as a class right now. So brain structures is another thing that this chapter goes over. There are a lot of brain structures, and if you're going to go into more advanced psychology or neurobiology or even biology course, you probably want to know them in more detail. For our purposes, we're going to really briefly go over a few of them to give you a sense of all the different things that the brain does. So here's a graphic of a bunch of the different places in the brain. You can see inside the middle here is a brain stem. And then we've got a bunch of functions right in the middle of the brain here that do a lot of things like sending messages or being part of the messaging system from one side of the brain to the other, from the back to the front. So there's a lot of like receiving and sending information stuff happening here. Then we've got the cerebral cortex, which is where we do a lot of our like language creation, thinking, planning up here at the top edge. So let's talk about a couple of those specific things. We're going to go through them pretty quickly, though. So the hindbrain is the oldest evolutionary part of the brain. If you look at snakes, they have a most of their brain is hindbrain. You can see they're very similar in structure. So it does some of the things you would expect a brain would need to do at the basic level. Things like controlling vital functions, heartbeat, breathing. Hopefully you don't have to think about making your heart beat. You might have to focus on breathing sometimes. But these kind of areas control some of those things. Also, this big area back here, the cerebellum, controls things like balance and coordinated movements. There are other areas of the brain, so your motor cortex as well is involved in that. So it's communicating with the motor cortex as well. So with this, this connects to the spinal cord. It evolved more than 500 million years ago. Also, things like alertness is part of that. So that's the hindbrain. And you can kind of see as we go through, these are kind of pieces that got added onto the brain through evolution over time. So I've got the hindbrain, and kind of sitting on top of it is the midbrain. So you can see the brain stem and the hindbrain right here. And then the midbrain is this area right here. Like I mentioned a little bit ago, this has a lot of connected systems between like a relay station. So there I've got relays in between eyes, ears, quick reactions. There's a lot of axons going to other sections of the brain for more connections. So here is the forebrain. The forebrain is the forward part. It's the most newly highly evolved portion of the brain. We've got things like, we've still got some things here towards the middle, but also we're looking at things more towards the outside as well. So we've got limbic system, thalamus, basal ganglia, hypothalamus, cerebral cortex. All of this is considered forebrain. So, and as you kind of go out, it's like newer material. So the limbic system has things for memory, emotion. You've got the amygdala for survival, mating rituals, emotions, hippocampus. So I guess if you were to think of Inside Out as a real show, they'd probably be living in the amygdala. So, but obviously that's not really how the brain works. Things are passed through the amygdala and passed through the emotion center of the brain when we experience new things or experience things that we've experienced before. It's run through that as part of the systems. The hippocampus, and I pretty much always get hippocampus and hypothalamus mixed up. So hippocampus, so hippos, I'll try to make a mnemonic for myself or something like hippos can remember really well instead of elephants. Elephants' memories are bad, hippos' memories are good. So the hippocampus is the one that does memory recall and storage, but it kind of directs the storage. So again, if you're thinking of the inside out characters, this limbic system is kind of where they live. They're directing the memories to long-term memory, that kind of thing. They're feeling the emotions, helping the character in the movie Riley survive. So limbic system is kind of where the inside out characters live. So the thalamus does a lot of message sensing across the brain. You've also got a lot of connections from the outside wrinkly portion in the cerebral cortex going through the thalamus. The basal ganglia is this pretty small, interesting looking structure here. It helps with voluntary movements, also a lot with habitual behaviors. So if you are pretty used to when you hear a certain tone, picking up your phone and hitting like the fingerprint sensor or something like that, that specific movement to get that fingerprint sensor every time, even without looking, that's going through your basal ganglia. Like it has become a habit. If you get a new phone with a fingerprint sensor on a slightly different part or a different button setup, you're going to have to learn a new habitual movement to get to that point. It might take a couple weeks to make that new habit. So with that, there can be a lot of problems with like symptoms like jerking or moving limbs unintentionally if there's damage to this area. All right, so this is the one that I sometimes confuse. So this is the hypothalamus. This one is monitoring. This is, you could think of it as one of the pleasure centers of the brain. It's not the only one. There are other pleasure centers of the brain, but this is one of them. So it looks at things like eating, drinking, sex, emotion, stress, rewards. It helps regulate the body's internal states, so it's part of the process, and it can talk to things like the pituitary gland to send and receive information from hormones in the body. But yeah, this is the hypothalamus, and that is distinct and different from the hippocampus, which is the hippocampus is the one for memory. The hypothalamus is one of the pleasure centers and regulating body internal states portions of the brain. So the cerebral cortex is the outer layer of cells. So if you took someone's brain out of their head, what you'd be seeing is mostly cerebral cortex, that outside wrinkly portion. And so it's about 80% of the brain's volume. We do all our critical thinking, our language, a lot of important kind of higher order functions that we consider like higher order abilities that humans have. They're with the cerebral cortex. So it is kind of divided off to specific areas. We've got occipital lobe, which does a lot of vision. We've got temporal lobe, which does a lot of language, understanding, as well as creation. Somatosensory cortex, where we feel things from our sensory neurons on our body. So like if you get poked in the arm on your right side, you would feel that in the somatosensory cortex. Then your primary motor cortex could tell that right arm to move. Frontal lobe, things like planning. So the cerebral cortex is the newest in terms of evolutionary time, and we think of it as higher level thinking, like making plans, doing language. So the different lobes have different functions. Like I said, occipital for vision, temporal for hearing, language, memory also. That being said, memory can be stored in many other places. If part of your memory is remembering how something felt specifically. Like, oh, I felt like my arm get poked right here, and you can like remember how that felt. That part of that memory would also be in the somatosensory cortex. So there's not just one area of your brain that stores memory. Basically, part of that network that made that memory becomes the memory. All right, so let's talk about the frontal lobes. These are some of the most interesting, or some that are the most distinct and different from a lot of our other non-human ancestors. So frontal lobes are where we really see personality, intelligence, voluntary muscle control, forward thinking, planning, goal setting. Those kinds of things kind of live there in the frontal lobes. So the example here, this is Phineas Gage. By his friends' reports before his accident, he was pretty nice guy, was pretty faithful to his wife, punctual with work, nice to people, that kind of thing. So had a pretty friendly demeanor and personality. One day he was working on the railroad, and this railroad tie, basically just a really giant bolt that helps tie things together on a railroad, in accidentally exploded early and went through his chin and damaged his eye as well, and then stuck out from his skull. So it damaged a large portion of his frontal lobe, but he survived. This is him standing or taking a photograph with that rod that went through his skull. And after that, people said he was incredibly different. He was rude, he was unfaithful to his wife, he was just kind of a jerk to people, he was distractible, he wasn't coming to work on time, things like that, which I mean, uh, definitely should have some kind of like workers' comp for that kind of accident, right? But that was back when those kinds of things, those kind of labor laws weren't in place. So when we don't have the frontal lobe, it can impact our personality. It can impact who people see us as, right? So a lot of who we are is down to a lot of things happening in our frontal lobe. So with this, at birth, these areas of the brain are already in the process of specializing. On average, this is where people's areas of the brain are, right? So language is generally centered here. That being said, if you are born without a temporal lobe, language will just develop in a different place of the brain. If you're young enough and this whole area gets really damaged, some of the rest of the brain can take that function on. The older you are, the harder it is to take entire functions of big areas of the brain, but smaller areas of damage, the brain's really good at making new connections or using other parts of the network that were part of the process to reroute those kinds of processes. So depending on your age, kind of lends itself to how well the brain can bounce back from something like, say, a traumatic brain injury or having a seizure and damaging a part of the brain. So, most researched area in infants and children is the temporal lobe, investigating language development. And we'll talk a lot about that as we get to the chapter on language development. So we can see here from the graph a little bit of the neurons growing in these different areas of the brain. So blue visual cortex, green auditory cortex, and then the prefrontal cortex, which is those like higher order functions, planning, forward thinking, things like that. And we can see each of these are developing a lot of neurons, a lot of connections as well for a while. And then they start to be pruned. So here the visual cortex, we get a lot of practice with the visual cortex quite early. And so having shapes, patterns, colors around a baby are really good. Different areas to see are really good for the development of those connections. And then since we get a lot of practice with it pretty early on, it starts to prune the connections that's not needed. So auditory context where learning and starting to be able to understand language, being able to speak it, and so we can then kind of cut away some of the connections that we're not actually using. Prefrontal cortex, it keeps growing more connections for a little bit longer time, but again, to be more efficient, anything we're not using, we start to cut out. That being said, this graph doesn't like drop to zero, right? Whatever we're using, kind of at this point, we're going to keep using. And if you work on something like your visual cortex, if you're practicing, I mean, there might be studies of this. You would probably look at people who play a variety of like first-person shooter games who are looking for other specific patterns and things like that, I would suspect that their visual cortex is making new dendrite and axon branches in a way that we could probably measure. And I would be surprised actually if there are not studies of that, if anybody wanted to do that as like a question paper. All right, so prefrontal cortex, this is the higher order functions, planning, reasoning, self-control. A lot of times we'll come back and talk about the prefrontal cortex because it's so central to the things that kind of make us human as we consider ourselves human, like the things that make us us. So it's also the executive control system. So a lot of things in your brain are happening on a loop and by default, you could say. And so those processes are just running. So that habit of you hear that sound, you pick up your phone, you push the fingerprint sensor, or your pattern of driving home from work the same way, the same time of day, that kind of thing. Those habits get really efficient in your brain. Your brain is running those. It might be doing them automatically in some cases, especially with a habit like maybe smoking, for example. You might just need a cigarette at a given time of day. That being said, your executive control system can say, nope, stop that process. We're going to do something else. It takes more energy to do that, like for your brain, like literally the energy that the cells are using. So it doesn't like to do that. It likes to do the easy habitual things, which is sometimes why it's so hard to, one, learn new things or break habits. Yeah. All right, so the somatosensory cortex, this really odd picture, is basically showing which parts of the somatosensory cortex are connected to where we have sensory organs. So we've got a lot more sensory receptors in hands, lips, face than we do in, say, our core. And then we've got, like, size-wise, the space on our body more in, say, genitals as well than like legs and feet. So you can see here on the brain how much space is dedicated to these different parts of our body's sensory organs. So this is us like feeling a touch on our arm versus feeling a touch on our face, that kind of thing. These are the areas of the brain that are doing that. So similarly, right next to it is the motor cortex. The motor cortex is now moving things on your body. So you can see there's a lot dedicated to the hand. There's a lot dedicated to the face or facial expressions, speaking, the tongue moving, swallowing as well. So these are all very important things versus here, you see your ankles and toes. There's not a lot of space dedicated to that as opposed to the hand. So that's why we're a lot better at fine motor control than with our feet. Though there are people who say have lost the ability to use their hands, but can still do something like play piano with their feet. So in that kind of case, it might be that this area is getting more dense with axon and dendrites and getting more connections there, or it might be that this area has substituted some of those functions. So it depends on the person. And it also depends like what age they were. If they're losing the use of their hands at say like 40, 50, 60, probably it's more dendrites here and axon branches here growing and making new connections versus if they're very young, you might have substitution of function over here. But again, it depends a little bit. To learn more about those things, go to the neurobiology or the PSYC class. All right, the next thing is the corpus callosum. This is a dense area right in the middle of the brain, and it's pretty wide, and it's essentially axons going back and forth. So it's sending information to both sides of the brain. So speaking of the somatosensory cortex, this is my right arm, even though it looks like the video is not flipped. This is my right arm. When I'm squeezing my right arm, this part of my brain on the left side of my brain is feeling that. That's where that signal's going to, versus when I'm squeezing my left arm, this right side of my brain is feeling that. Then when I'm moving my right arm, the left side motor cortex is sending that signal to my right arm. When I'm moving my left arm, the right side of my brain is sending that. So for like sensory organs and moving, the brain is kind of flipped that way. But yeah, the corpus callosum is part of that process of sending those messages across. So it's connected to a lot of different areas of the brain, very important for basically everything we do. So with that being said, it also goes to show that when we think about the things humans do, we're using the majority of the areas of our brain all the time. There's not such thing as a person who's left-brained or right-brained being more artsy or more mathematic. both art and math take some of the same components of the brain and have to use them and process them. And it's not down to something as simple as being left or right focused on your brain. The things that are focused on the left or right are your sensory and motor cortex for your right limbs are on the left side. And then the right side of your brain are focused on the left side of your body. So that's really the only thing that's divided. For most people as well, language is on the left side of their brain. Again, unless there's something like an injury, on average, most people are developing that language portion on that left side of their brain. Yeah, other than that, pretty much everything is spread across, going across both sides, communicating back and forth, that kind of thing. But with that, remember the brain is plastic in the sense that it can develop new connections. If you get damage to an area, it can do a pretty good job at adjusting, again, depending on the extent of that damage. All right, the endocrine system is one that we often kind of leave out for the nervous system. But this is the system of glands and organs that release and read chemicals in the bloodstream. So things like adrenaline or insulin or cortisol, these are melatonin. So the endocrine system is part of the body's communication system. And so it is connected through the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, where it's getting messages sent out to the endocrine system and getting messages from the endocrine system. So that's a major connection portion of the brain. And the endocrine system is a lot slower than neurons. So neurons can fire quite quickly. So in humans, on average, they're firing about 200 times a second. But they can go a little faster or slower as well, depending on how much energy they're getting, essentially. But the endocrine system usually has to deal with filling up to a certain level in the bloodstream. So that's why you've probably heard someone say, hey, when you're eating and you're trying to watch your weight, wait 15 minutes before taking seconds. Because it takes about 15 minutes for the hormones from your stomach that are being produced and pancreas that are being produced to be read by, say, the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus and say, hey, I'm full. So if you eat it all too fast, you're going to eat too much because your brain is not getting those signals that you are full yet. So with this, we have a lot of changes that occur with the brain immediately after birth, mostly because now that you're out of the womb, you can start to use your sight. You do hear sounds in the womb. And it does seem to have an impact on how easily you can learn language, actually. But the sounds are much clearer when you're not inside of another human, right? The smells, the ability to touch. And so this is why it's so important to play with infants because they don't need like special toys. And honestly, things like iPads, really bad idea because that doesn't make sense to their brains cognitively. They don't connect what that essentially is. But things like blocks or seeing animals and stuffed animals or a mobile, different patterns, being read to, like these really simple things are exactly what an infant needs for their brain to start making connections, figuring out, oh, I need these patterns for my dendrites. So they don't need expensive special toys. A few kind of specific toys, like blocks, are really great. Being able to see things that are different patterns, being able to talk to people are some of the best things for infants specifically. And that's pretty true as we age up as well. Another big focus of the chapter is growth, physical growth through life. So in addition to brain development, here is how we grow really briefly. Like there's basically brief paragraphs for each phase of life, and we'll kind of touch on why that physical growth is relevant to like socio-emotional things as we go on. So like if you're not growing as fast, if your fine or gross motor skills are not as good, maybe you're not chosen to play games, that kind of thing. We'll get into that later on in the book. But for infancy, we see a cephalocaudal and proximal distal pattern of growth. So cephalocaudal, it's listed up there. Proximal distal, it's listed up here. It basically means that we tend to, as humans, grow kind of from top to bottom and center out. So that's oftentimes why you see babies with really big heads. Also, their limbs are disproportionate. Their core grows earlier than their limbs. So we kind of grow head to toe and core out. So with this, we also see that this is a really good example of discontinuous growth or jumps or spurts. So oftentimes we think of growth as being really consistent, but there are some things that grow in really discontinuous ways. So spurts. Growth spurts are an example of that. For infants, you might have a growth spurt that lasts a single day or up to like 48 hours. And usually there's a long time, like a couple weeks between growth spurts. Also, if you grow more in your spurt, it'll be a little longer till your next spurt on average. So the biggest growth spurts that we've seen in infants are 7/10 of an inch in length. So that's almost an entire inch grown in like a 24, 48 hour period. That's ridiculous. And then head circumference expanding 3/10 of an inch in that about single day as well. So that is dramatic. And that's just what we've measured. So growth spurts might not be that big every single time, but you grow that big or grow that much over a single day, then you wait a couple weeks, maybe even a month before you have your next growth spurt. With this in infancy, most average newborns are 18 to 22 inches long and they're about 7.5 pounds. They lose a lot of their body weight right at the beginning, right after they're born, because they're adjusting to the feeding process. Now they have to actually suck for their food, swallow, digest their food. But after they figure that out, also after, say, a parent's milk comes in, then they're able to grow pretty rapidly. So 5 to 6 ounces a week and about 3/4 of an inch each month for the first year on average. So again, that 3/4 of an inch, that could be one single growth spurt in that month, which is pretty amazing. You've probably seen these kind of growth charts before. Essentially, we see growth slowing at about age 2. We see that children are about a fifth of their adult weight. You can see the range there. They're about half of their adult height. At age 2, you can measure like their height, their weight, their foot size, and you can get a pretty good estimate of about how tall they will be in adulthood when they're fully grown. So again, there's other things that affect that. Nutrition, for example, if you break a limb on like a growth plate area, then that might change over time. So there are environmental factors that can affect this, but it gives you a pretty good average. So with that, I'm 6 foot. My wife is 5'2", and then the kids will both be in between. So my youngest will be the tallest most likely, just a couple, like an inch or two shorter than me, and then their older sibling will be an inch or two shorter than them. So based on the predictions, if they don't eat their fruits and vegetables, might not get to that height. So with this, we see the brain developing all those neurons, and with making all those new connections, it's really important to protect babies from falls. In infancy, it's very important to protect the baby's head because their head is still a little smaller than it will be later on. It's much more susceptible to concussions and being sloshed around within their skull. So do not shake babies. Even if they won't stop crying, it's a much better thing for that baby if you set the baby down, go to another room, calm down, even though they're crying and they're upset, and then coming back. Shaking a baby will not help. It will make things much, much worse. So by the second birthday, the brain's already about 75% the adult weight, because again, we're getting more stem cells becoming neurons through that time to then migrate to where they're going to live. So by that time, the rest of the weight is not really neurons, it's connections, it's other like fluid in the brain, that kind of thing that changes as your skull gets bigger too. So we study the infant's brain using PETs that uses X-rays. That's a little quicker than things like MRIs because MRIs require a patient to be still, which is very difficult for an infant. EEG works pretty well. You can also do FNIRS, which is basically like an X-ray, but it's using near infrared light, and that works pretty well. And you can even do EEG and FNIRS when the baby is moving around. So if you're watching a baby's brain while they're crawling, you can put like a special cap that detects, which is pretty neat. You can't do something like that with a PET or an MRI because the baby has to be pretty still. For an X-ray, very briefly still. For an MRI, still for a long time. So as we go into early childhood, we see that average children grow about to 2.5 inches and gain about 5 to 7 pounds. Girls are only slightly smaller until about puberty. Bodies lengthen mostly. If you see children that are heavier, that's mostly due to genetics. Nutrition does impact growth of early children as well, but most of the body variations you see in early childhood is mostly down to the genetics of that child. So brain development has a huge effect on cognitive development throughout this time. Again, after you get past infancy, the overall size doesn't really change much, but it becomes more dense with relevant connections. You also see things like being in a low income area that is correlated to less density of neurons. And that kind of makes sense. If you have less opportunity to interact with a variety of things, you are not going to make as many connections. But while that's a risk factor, there is a protective factor of maternal sensitivity. So the more responsive and concerned the mom is with the children, and this could go for another parent too. Most of the studies with children are with mothers, though. You will see more density of neurons. So maternal sensitivity is a protective factor that can override or kind of cancel out being in a low income area. So if they're giving more care and concern, that gives the brain a lot more connections, which is great. So with this, the prefrontal cortex does grow dramatically in early childhood, makes more connections, more myelination. While that's being said, we're not fully myelinated in the prefrontal cortex. Again, things are always kind of myelinating, but it's mostly in that pattern from the back to the front. So if you don't remember what the prefrontal cortex does, rewind a little bit in the video to see that specific part of the brain. And actually, this is in the wrong place. For the nervous system. This was supposed to be earlier on with the brain. But there are a couple different areas. We see the central nervous system with the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system are the nerves, the motor neurons telling our muscles to move, and the sensory nervous system as well, giving us sensations, inputs from organs, as well as hormones that are coming in. So with this, as we get to middle and late childhood, we see that there are a lot of changes that happen. We see like 2 to 3 inches a year of height, 5 to 7 pound a year in weight. Most weight gain at this time in middle to late childhood is actually coming from the skeleton growing. The skeleton also becomes more stiff and dense. This is why we see more broken bones in middle and, well, there's a couple reasons. One, the skeleton is becoming more stiff throughout middle and late childhood. So that is one of the reasons. Another is because of the gross motor skills and fine motor skills are much better. We also see middle and late children taking much more risks, say on a playground, playing more sports, things like that, that are more organized. So a little more likely to be in a situation where they might break a limb versus in early childhood. But even in early childhood and infancy, your bones are still a little bit more flexible and malleable, so they can bend a little bit more before breaking, versus at this point, they're getting stiffer, so they can't bend as much before breaking. All right, with this, we see that our brain is pretty much its adult weight by age 6. And then by the end of late childhood, the dendrites are still being formed, still being pruned. So that's just a consistent pattern that happens throughout your entire life, that the neurons are sending out to make new connections. Let's say you are 7 years old and you start playing guitar. You're going to make a bunch of new connections to help you do that. Then if you stop playing guitar, eventually that will be pruned away, basically reabsorbed by the neurons. So, and there is more activation of the prefrontal cortex. Part of that's just from more experience, more social experience, more training, more expectations to be able to do things like goal setting, planning ahead, inhibiting reactions, things like that. So we see that gross motor and fine motor skills are much smoother at this age as well. Usually boys are outperforming girls in gross motor skills, things like jumping, running, and girls are usually outperforming boys at fine motor skills. But again, this is an individual difference. If you practice gross motor more, you'll be better at that. If you practice fine motor more, you'll be better than that at that too. So we also see the myelination helping with that fine motor skill, as those kind of motor areas for the hands are getting myelinated. It's a lot easier to do fine motor messaging. So piano playing, handwriting, that is a lot better as we get through middle and late childhood. And then after middle and late childhood, my handwriting really took a nosedive. It's really awful today. So my youngest is in middle childhood, and their handwriting is getting to be better than mine. It's surpassed mine basically now. So with this, a big section that we'll focus on and that your book spends more time on is puberty. Puberty is usually the marker of the beginning of adolescence. So it's kind of a fuzzy time of when does adolescence start? But here, there is actually brain processes that provide the stimulation for the entire puberty process. And that starts earlier on in life in middle and late childhood rather than in the teen years. And so it is a process. If you've watched Inside Out 2, it might seem like a big portion of puberty happens over a whole weekend in that movie. In reality, that's just a movie. It's to show a bunch of things about puberty. But really, it's a long process. So it usually starts around and ends in between the ages of 9 and 16. That starting point is programmed into your genes. There are environmental factors that will influence it, such as if you have more body fat percentile, it basically sends more messages to your body that you're ready for starting your body getting ready for baby making, essentially. So, like higher fat seems to be earlier onset puberty, those kinds of things. But there are a bunch of other factors as well. So one really key thing to consider here is the timing of puberty. So some of these changes that we notice in puberty are visible to an outside person, some are not visible to an outside person, right? So something like a height spurt would be pretty obvious to like friends, breast growth would be pretty obvious to friends, but some of these are not going to be obvious to friends, right? That they wouldn't necessarily notice them. But there are differences that we see between people who are female versus male and the timing of puberty and the socio-emotional interactions that in, they encounter. So we also see that this timing of puberty seems to be earlier than in previous generations. There's a lot of epigenetic effects that we're looking at. So high weight, BMI, obesity, earlier onset, stress and conflict, earlier onset. And so this does impact people. So we see for early maturing girls specifically, they have a higher risk factors for smoking, drinking, eating disorders, early dating and sexual experiences, higher likelihood of depression, and tend to view themselves more negatively when they're doing early starts to puberty. And if you look at the research, essentially what they find is that girls who are early maturing, they're often rejected by their friend group. Like there might be some initial, oh, cool, you're starting puberty. But then as their body changes and they look different than their friend group, they will often be rejected from that friend group. And so the friends that accept them are usually older than these, might even be children and not teens, right? These these child girls, these children, who are not ready for socio-emotional kind of relationships like a dating or sexual experience, and but maybe pushed into that earlier because their body looks different than you might expect for, say, a 10-year-old or an 11-year-old or a 12-year-old. So it is a big risk factor for early maturing in girls versus for boys, it's kind of the opposite. So early maturing boys view themselves more positively. They're usually more successful in peer relations. So the friends groups are like, oh, cool, you're growing taller or getting more muscle. They usually do better in like sports and things like that. So oftentimes they will focus more on their physical performance than their academics. And so for girls, we see early maturing has risk factors, late maturing for girls has protective factors, versus early maturing for boys has some protective factors. There are some risk factors in there too. And then late maturing has more risk factors. So if you're one of the last maturing in your friend group of boys, you might be more teased and more ostracized. So whatever gender you are, though, we see that all adolescents are preoccupied with their body image. On average, girls tend to be more dissatisfied as puberty progresses, and boys tend to be more satisfied as puberty progresses. And this is also a time where we can see the body image problems becoming a big thing. And so we see either health enhancing or not health enhancing behaviors starting, whether it is regular exercise or whether it is extreme exercise or eating disorders. This is the time we often see these start. They can start earlier, they can start later, but for most people, this is where we see them start. Another big time where we see them start is like early adulthood as well. Those are like the two peak times for, say, eating disorders to appear, but they can appear other times as well. So this is a video on puberty. This is a really good one that I will just link into I might try to like download it and put it into the video. But a key piece here is first, before you watch the video, what time did your high school start? Maybe end of middle school, but as well, high school. What time was that? And it goes a little more into detail of the brain, and it goes into sleep and how that's a challenge for adolescents, uh, and a couple more physical and neurological changes that are happening during puberty. So I may try to cut it and put it into this lecture video. So if you see it in a couple seconds, it worked. Oftentimes when I do that with a video, even though it's efficient and effective, so you don't have to click around to other videos, YouTube will block it because it's all of their content. So if not, click on the other link that I've provided, or it'll be in just a second. All right, back to it. So here we see that in adolescence, the brain is changing differently. The limbic system is getting myelinated. So the emotion center, the reward center, this is finishing its myelination. So it's faster. So the brain defaults to these faster networks during adolescence. And this is why adolescents seem more emotionally reactive, because it's easier for their brains to go through that emotion center. So they are literally feeling more emotions and stronger emotions than at any other time in their life. So it is a big change. Later in adolescence, we see more connections between the prefrontal cortex and limbic system. That being said, you can practice those things. You can practice some of those higher order functions and do them the same as an adult, as an adolescent. It does just take your brain a little more energy, a little more training. You've not had as much practice yet. So more practice means better use of prefrontal cortex. The finalizing of that myelination of that prefrontal cortex is around 23. But yeah, stronger, more emotions than at any other time of their life, pretty dramatically. So they're not quite as capable because of the lack of practice and the lack of myelination to regulate those emotions. All right, so physical growth in early adulthood, we oftentimes see peak performance for humans in between the ages of 19 and 26. So if you are before that time, congratulations, you're going to have peak physical performance soon. If you're after that time, I'm sorry for the news, but you might have already been aware of that. So muscle tone and strength begin to decline at about age 30. That being said, like other things plasticity-wise, if you keep exercising, eating healthily, having regular activity, you will keep that muscle tone and strength. Also, kind of same thing with your cognitive abilities. If you're working on with your brain, learning new things, trying new things, your cognition is going to stay for a while. So with this, we also see mortality is 2 times higher in early adulthood than for adolescents. Oftentimes we think of adolescence being kind of a dangerous time, but we actually see a lot more risk of death by both suicide, unintentional injury. Other includes things like, I think other included car accidents, and unintentional injury was not car accidents. I can't remember for sure from this study, but other definitely includes like illnesses, like cancer and things like that. So it is also another time we often see chronic health problems appear. You might see signs of them earlier on, but a lot of them are usually not diagnosed until early adulthood. So multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, these are more often diagnosed in early adulthood, partially because we now have more symptoms at that time and that kind of thing. Another big problem regarding health in early adults is that because their bodies are kind of in a peak physical performance state, oftentimes early and emerging adults are doing a lot of health compromising behaviors. They're not considering how those behaviors will impact their health long term. Again, they are still, and some of you might be in this category, you might still be getting used to planning ahead and thinking about life at 10, 20, 30 years in the future. So oftentimes we see early adults have really poor sleep schedules. Some of these things are down to the kinds of things you have to do. If you're doing gig work or if you have to be at 2 jobs, or more than two jobs, you might have to have a really poor sleep schedule, but that's not good for the longevity of your body overall. Oftentimes, early adults are not eating regular meals, smaller snacks or unhealthy big meals at like right before bed, excessive drinking and or smoking, and risky sexual behaviors. And all these things can have an impact, create long-lasting changes in the body and the epigenetics that could last a long time. So that's early adulthood. We'll get to middle and late adulthood in a minute. Your book goes into a little more detail than we will in class about why we sleep, but sleep is a really important function for a lot of things, and we won't spend a lot of time on it. Like literally, this slide is all I have in the slideshow here. It is a really interesting topic, though. Feel free to do some more research on it and go from some of the resources in your book. But some of the main reasons why we sleep is that it seems to probably have protected human ancestors. So you're not, before we had, say, street lights or flashlights, you're not going to like walk off a cliff or fall out of off of the place, your treehouse or your home, or get stabbed by something that you don't see if you're not wandering around in the dark. Sleep also restores and resets a lot of systems across our body, not just in the brain, but there's a lot of systems that need that kind of relaxed time, kind of reset themselves. It does. It is a time when the brain does a lot of the cleaning out of waste from neurons. So that helps it work more efficiently the next day. A lot of the connections between neurons are strengthened during sleep. You're always making those connections and they're getting stronger. But when the brain doesn't have to focus on processing new things, it can spend more energy on making those connections stronger, making those memories stronger, making those new skill connections stronger. So that helps a lot with plasticity in the brain in general. And if you have this cycle for it to kind of relax, do those processes to strengthen that learning or new connections, then the next day it can work a lot more effectively. And you've probably seen this in your own life. If you have tried to pull all-nighters, a couple in a row, you're not functioning very well. So I remember my freshman year of college, I was in a biology class, and I realized, hey, my biology class is a really early class. I started at like 7 a.m. or something like that, which was a bad idea for the age I was and my brain needing sleep. So I thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to hang out with my friends, like earlier in the evening, and then I'm just going to stay up all night so I can study for like 8 hours, and then I'll take the test right after I finish studying and I'll do great. I bet you can guess I did not do great on that test. I did stay up the 8 hours to study, and I didn't do super well. I don't remember my actual grade, but it was poor. Definitely affected my overall GPA from that. I think it was like a midterm. It might have been a final, but it was not good. So use that example. We need more sleep. Your brain needs the time to rest, to make those connections, clear out things. Other systems in your body need to reset. So there's a lot of reasons why we do sleep. So yeah. From there, we can jump into the lifespan in middle and late adulthood. And I do want to watch a couple of these videos. All of them are really good. I'm going to watch this first one. This is actually one of my professors at grad school talking about late adult development.
Nakamura, and I study aspects of positive adult development, including mentoring in the professional context and social innovation in the second half of life. We've been studying social innovators who are all over the age of 60, so in their 60s, 70s, 80s. We were interested in the question of how they came to be doing what they're doing. And the vast majority of them are people who are actively seeking something to do to contribute to society. And they weren't people who were tapped because of their expertise to do something to contribute to society. They were people who had sort of stumbled into a problem that they felt they couldn't ignore and wound up feeling like they needed to take it on themselves. One example of these lives organized around social purpose was an individual who had been a war vet, and when he was being treated in a VA hospital, was observing the young soldiers who had come back from the Gulf War and realized that one of his own passions, which was fly fishing, might be something that he could share with them. And he created a program that allowed war veterans to go out into the country and experience a very restorative kind of healing activity. So essentially, he was taking his own flow experiences and sharing them with these veterans. Yeah, so we've been learning from the research that we're conducting on the daily lives of older individuals whose lives are centered around a social purpose, that the work has both emotional and experiential costs, but also benefits, and that the benefits, like seeing the impact of one's work on others, outweigh the costs. Sort of traditional scripts for the retirement years are sort of centered around leisure. And the research that we're doing presents alternative possibilities. This has been called sort of the encore career, and the notion that another possible pathway for those years is giving back in one way or another.
So a really good couple concrete examples from their studies on adult development and specifically purpose and people who are doing things in their community. This one's a really good example, if you want to watch it linked through the video, of a woman and her daughter and how they live their life and do things that are leisure, but also how the parent is taking effort to learn how to use computers, to learn new technology, to do things with friends, and be very active. So overall, this is a big, this up here, we'll probably watch this later on in the class because this one really gets into a lot more socio-emotional development versus physical development. But I wanted to bring this up now because we'll bring it up many, many times as we talk about late adult development, some of the main things we see to have positive adult development, as well as longevity. So this is some notes I took on a research article by Dr. Csikszentmihalyi and Dr. Rathun. So this is basically a model of successful development. And this kind of gives you an example of how I take notes on research articles. So there you go. You can read it, but I've also got it in a nice, more visually interesting way here. So they really found 6 things that were the most important for late adult development. So all of these things are protective factors or lead to other positive factors. So one is health and fitness. Regular exercise that you enjoy, that you will continue to do, will keep your body a lot better, preserving the mind by doing things that challenge it. Learning new things, trying new games, trying new hobbies, continuing vocation. And this doesn't actually have to be something like you're paid to do. This can be working at a nonprofit, volunteering regularly, gardening, right? So doing something that you are being actively engaged with. My father-in-law does a lot of woodworking. And so he's into late adulthood, and that's his continuing vocation. He does projects around the house. He builds cabinets and shelves and things like that. So even though it's not out with other people, he does have a continued vocation. Another thing is keeping up relationships with family and friends. So regularly seeing them inside a house or outside your house, hanging out with people. And as you get further into late adulthood, it can become harder because oftentimes we see in far late adulthood mobility issues and things like that. But as much as you can, keeping up with relationships. Yeah, it can be helped with things like Zoom and technology as well. Staying involved in the community is another really good way that you can build friendships, stay connected with people, learn things that are preserving your mind, be moving around. And that is also an example of beyond the self engagement as well. So if you're volunteering somewhere twice a week to help and support others, teach some skills, you're probably keeping relationships, engaged beyond yourself, have a continued vocation as you're doing these things. So a lot of the things you can do are overlapping multiple of these. If you're teaching dance class for late adults as a late adult. You're doing health and fitness, you're engaging with people, you're involved, you're probably very purposeful. It's a continued vocation. So you can do a lot of things in late adulthood that are really relevant to preserve your capacities, your physical capacities, your mental capacities, be happier, healthier, feel better about yourself. And that's really what our hybrid activity this week is about this late adult development as well. Some physical things that we see are visible signs of age, wrinkles, sags, age spots, hair thinning and graying. Honestly, for me, the graying started when I was like 13 and the thinning started when I was like 20. Um, so that's been fun. Nails thickening, becoming more brittle, teeth yellowing. We also tend to, as we get further into later adulthood, middle and then to later adulthood, start to lose height. So a lot of that comes from the bones and losing some bone mass. With that being said, if you're doing something like resistance training with weights, it makes that happen slower. But for men, it's not as dramatic as for women. Men are losing about a half an inch from age 30 to 50, and another 3/4 of an inch, almost a whole inch from about 50 to 70, versus women about 2 inches from 25 to 75. So some of this is the cartilage and the connective tissues in the spine. And my face might be in the way here, but kind of compressing over time, but also losing some bone mass. So altogether leads to some shrinking. We also see obesity is across middle and then into late adulthood. We see strength, joints, and bones decrease in their efficiency and effectiveness. Again, if you do things, and this usually is happening further into late adulthood. So this is into the 60s, 70s kind of thing. So you can see some pictures of Sean Connery here at different times in life. And with this, if you're doing things physically, these capacities will be maintained for longer. The loss of these capacities will be decreased. So cartilage, connective tissues, they become less efficient over time and less cushiony for bone movements, more joint stiffness. This is exacerbated if you've ever had like a serious injury or something like that. So, and also this bone loss. So eating fruits and veggies, doing weightlifting kind or any kind of resistance training really helps to protect against this happening. So with this, just bringing this up again, a lot of these problems can be maintained for longer or reduced in their impact to you on your physical body by doing these things. Focusing on your health and fitness, focusing on your relationships, staying involved with people, preserving your mind, continuing doing something important to you and something meaningful beyond yourself. Whether that beyond yourself is your family, your partner, the community at large. There's a lot of ways to go about this. So with this, let's talk about longevity. This is about life expectancy and the lifespan. So it seems like the human maximum, the longevity of the lifespan, is between about 120 and 125 years. So not a lot of humans get to that point, but that looks like about the theoretical maximum for what humans can live to. So with this, the estimates in the US for by 2030 are that the longevity will be about, on average again, 83.3 years for women and 79.5 for men. There are also factors such as health conditions and medical care. Places with better medical care have longer longevity, and there are also ethnic differences. Your book points out a few that certain ethnicities seem to have higher longevity than other ethnicities. And so part of that is a question of, is this the genetics of that ethnicity? Is that cultural background of the ethnicity, like the things they eat and the activity that they do? A lot of cultures around the world are much more involved with family than when you hear like nuclear family as a term in the US, that's like a parent and the kids. But what happens when the kids leave? Well, then you just got the parents, and those kids maybe have those kids now are parents with their own kids. So what do those old parents do that are now becoming grandparents? Oftentimes in the U.S. culture of the nuclear family, they're very lonely and not engaged. Versus a lot of communities and cultures, grandparents are part of the household, maybe living in the same place or very close to, very heavily involved, and so that helps a lot with longevity. So with that, we have a lot of studies of centenarians, individuals who are 100 and more, and we do see increases of centenarians. The study of centenarians is difficult because Some people don't have like birth certificates anymore, right? If they're a person who is in a war-torn place, we've actually found a few people who claimed to have been over 100 were actually the children of people who passed away and were collecting on like their pension benefits. But we do have actual people who have lived over 100 years old. Um, so we do see this increasing over time as well. The highest ratio of centenarians in the world is Okinawa in Japan. We see about 34 centenarians for every 100,000 inhabitants. And we attribute this to things, well, we've got them communicating, telling it as they see it, why they are over 100 years old. This is a really great interview, but it's all in Japanese. And we get to all the relevant points just here in the lecture, but this is a screenshot I really wanted to put up here. They were asked, well, why did you all live to over 100? All these people are over 100. So they said, because we have a lot of fish in this village. That might sound silly, but in reality, it's not that silly. They are eating a very healthy diet. They have a pretty stress-free lifestyle. They have regular, like, we go out and we fish, we come back home, we hang out, we cook dinner together. They have a caring community. They're very active, walking around their community a lot. There's a lot of walking paths where these individuals live. There's not as much driving there, and they say they're very spiritual, and so they're coming together for cultural rituals and spiritual rituals and things like that. So they're engaged with each other and with people of different ages. They're also actively doing things with one another, playing games, going out fishing. So this is the kind of thing that keeps you alive longer, with a happy life longer, is having that kind of continued vocation, engagement with people, being physically active, engaging your mind. So we also see lower risk from things like dying from cancer in Okinawa versus Japan at large, and then much different than the United States. So there are a lot of things that we can do. Healthy diet, whatever you can do to bring your stress down, you'll live longer. Having a caring community, whether that's friends, family, both, and having general activity around like physically, mentally, that kind of thing. Those are the things you can do to live longer. So why do we age? Why do we age? Why do we die? Well, these are all the main theories of why we age and why we die. I'll go over them. I have slides individually on them, but honestly, I really think that it's text heavy, but I think this diagram from your book really spells it out. Evolutionarily, well, we haven't really adapted those late adult changes. Yeah. Natural selection is much more tied to reproduction. So there are things that have probably been selected out because grandparents helping care for children is beneficial. So there are probably some evolutionary changes in natural selection that have kept people alive this long. But natural selection is much more tied to everything that happens before you have children and soon after. Cellular clock theory seems like some cells can only divide a maximum of around 80 times, and they become less and less capable of dividing. This is because, I'll scroll forward a little bit. At the end of your chromosomes, you've got a bunch of extra DNA called telomeres. And essentially, as you divide this chromosome and the DNA, it gets shorter and shorter. There are errors in copying DNA when you split a cell. And the more and more times you split that cell, the more and more likely you will make more and more errors. So we have basically a bunch of extra DNA as a protective layer. You can think of it like the end of a shoelace kind of thing. And it's chopping into that basically unused DNA. And then once you start chopping into the used DNA, you might start to see some problems. Organs not working properly, things like that. Free radicals might be a term that you have heard before, but what it means in scientific sense is that they're ions, oxygen ions, that can literally damage DNA and other structures. So little tiny ion particles of oxygen that can damage DNA. So that's maybe not what you've thought of before as free radicals, but it's essentially ions that really shouldn't be there, but they weren't carried away with the waste, that kind of thing. And kind of like a car rusting, that ion can damage various cellular structures. Mitochondrial theory, it might be that the mitochondria within cells are in and of themselves slowing down aging and dying too, making it harder for the cells to do its job. Serotonin theory is that there's a bunch of proteins that influence how long we live, how we read the DNA, how our body does things. Stress makes those things work not as well. And it has a big impact on cardiovascular functioning. So over time, that can lead to aging as well and breakdown of body systems. We've also got other aspects of our growth and our metabolism and our hormones. So stress overall increases the likelihood of all of these things. So our nutrition, our stress, our sleep really impacts these. If we have bad of all that, these things are generally happening faster. Not the evolutionary piece, but the cellular clock theory, free radical, mitochondrial, mTOR pathway. So all of these together lead to things like organs failing, getting sick, and in the end, death. So there are things we can do to prevent that. So there's some more detail about each of these, but honestly, I think that um, is that slide I think is relevant enough. So the brain is slowly losing its weight between about ages of 20 to 90. Most of this decrease is in the shrinkage of the neurons themselves. The cells actually getting a little smaller. You can lose neurons, they can die. Things like alcohol poisoning are very good at killing neurons. But other things like traumatic brain injuries can kill neurons. But usually neurons are last pretty well. But if you're not using your brain, if you're not engaging it, you are going to lose those branches of dendrites, those branches of axons, and you will have slower functioning over the lifespan. So that slower functioning can affect your physical performance, your coordination. You might not feel as comfortable doing things like communicating with people if you're not as good at it anymore. And that's really when you should be working on it more as well. So we do have some neurogenesis in different parts of our brain. It doesn't seem to be really impactful in humans, but we're still studying this. But at any time in our life, we can have more dendrites grow. We can rewire to compensate for losses. If you're trying new things, you will be sending more energy to your brain. Eating healthily helps as well. And we also see older brains are using both hemispheres more than younger brains. So, and that's basically the brain has realized, hey, I can use more of me in an efficient way. And it's taken a long time into later adulthood for the brain to start processing things that way. While the brain earlier on in life might try to focus in one area and process all here, it's realized, hey, if I spread this load out between all these neurons, I will do a better job. So we see other physical changes, especially with bone mass, muscle mass. We see a lot of bigger changes after age 60. Honestly, you could put, like we're talking about middle and late adulthood, you could put middle adulthood as a really big span from about 30 or 35 to about 50, 55, 60. And then you could take 60 to say 90 and split it up to say late adulthood and then late adulthood after 75. We see dramatic differences at about 60 and then at about 75, and then as we get into the 90s, more dramatic changes. Besides those times, things are a little more on a plateau. They decrease slower and not as dramatically. So here's a graph of looking at the differences of body composition. So we've got purple is muscle, the green is fat, the blue is bone, and the orange is a bunch of other organs and fluids and systems in your body. So you can see the fat at age 25, which is the green, 20% versus 40% at 75. So pretty dramatic difference. Bone loss from 10% to 8%. And then in muscle mass it goes from 30 to 15%. And so that's a big change in your body. Again, these main things that we talked about a few minutes ago, this slide of 6 main things. These are the things to have a healthy mind over the lifespan, and we will come to this a couple times in the course of this class because I'm a positive psychologist. I want people to have well-being across their lifespan. I want people to have protective factors to be happy, healthy, feel like they have purpose in their life. And these are basically the simple ways. Like you can do these in a lot of unique ways for you. So I do want you to consider what will you be doing in your late adulthood where you can get as many of these as possible to increase your longevity and your happiness across the lifespan. But that is the end of this chapter. Pay attention to the syllabus to figure out what chapter we are jumping to next. Just remember, in this class, we don't always go straight through the book, so double check your syllabus about what chapter you are going to next.